Morning, everybody. Welcome to the Satisfaction Green Tea session. We're coming to the end of a set of 3 green teas. We started out with Towering Pine. Last week we did a beautiful Dragon Well. And today we're going to go to a completely different area, Yunnan Province, and talk about satisfaction. Before I talk about satisfaction, I should conclude something that I didn't say last week with Dragon Well. Remember, I went through that whole discussion about how they arrived, and that's how the Chinese arrived, that Dragon Well is one of the 10 great notable teas. One of the things I didn't say, and I should have at the very end, through the tasting, you then got the feel of why Dragon Well stands out. And so I did want to emphasize that because Dragon Well really does stand out as green tea. The other green teas on that top 10 list also stand out. So is satisfaction on that top 10 list? The answer would be no. There's lots of reasons. Part of it is historical. So let's go through a little bit of history, and then I'm going to do something a little unusual today. So let's start with the traditional stuff, history, give you a few dates, bore you a little bit before we get to the really exciting stuff. So it's recorded in Chinese history that back at least a couple thousand years ago, tea was coming from this general region. Okay, what region am I talking about? Yunnan. And it's Yunnan a little bit towards the central and a little bit veering towards the west central. And tea was already being exported from there and going to various places in China, probably leaving China into Southeast Asia, may actually have already started to go into Central Asia. Unknown. So you hear that, and if you are careless and not paying attention to details, you make the following statement, which I've seen, by the way. Oh, yes, pu'er has been going around the world. And let's get rid of the around the world. Pu'er has been being sent as tribute tea since at least the Tang Dynasty to the capital. And what's wrong with that statement, aside from being false? That's the key thing. I mean, they conflated two things. Tea leaves from a region with tea style. Can't do that. And this is what gets people in trouble over and over again. I have no proof, I have no evidence that anything like pu'er was being done, or fermented tea. I used pu'er, I should have used fermented. Nothing like fermented tea, as far as we know, as far as we can tell, was being done. There's no real written record of that having occurred. Maybe it did occur, but show me the proof. So that's the first thing. There's plenty of proof that tea from this region, and let's start giving these regions a name, because this is very important. Lincang, Lincang. Why is Lincang important? Because today, in the world, in terms of fermented pu'er tea, Lincang is the world leader. That's volume-wise. You can't say, it's always a qualitative question to say, well, does it have the world's best fermented tea? No, you really can't say that, because fermented tea comes, really outstanding fermented tea comes from several places. But Lincang is big because they have about 400,000 acres under cultivation. And that's also deceptive. So let me back that up again. Let me say it a different way. Part of that is what they call plantation or tableland tea. That's fancy words for saying rows and rows of tea planted, clonal tea, right? And then part of that is old trees, ancient trees. You have the whole mix in the forest. You have those set of trees. And so, what percentage of that 400,000 might the planted be versus what's in the forest? Nobody has an exact figure, but all the figures I've seen seem to point to about 55% planted and 45% ancient and old tree. Yes.
So one of the pictures you sent shows a hillside or mountainside with rows of shorter plants, and so
Right.
that would be one of the plantation
Yes.
style areas.
Great catch on that. Yes, one of the pictures did show plantation style. And again, it's always identifiable because it's rows and rows. Does this mean that all, and thank you for bringing that up, because does this mean that all trees were planted by squirrels or butterflies or, by nature? And the answer is no. It really depends on the age of the tree. So if you're looking at trees anywhere from 100 years old up to 900, up to 1,000 years old, those all could have been planted by humans, and they wouldn't have been planted in a monoclonal way. They would have been spread throughout forest tracts. The forest wouldn't have been around it, wouldn't have been cut down. They'd have been interspersed there, still planted by humans, but not the monoclonal. Once you get to about 1700 years old, it's very unlikely that a human planted it. It's mostly nature or some god coming down and planting the trees. Those are your real choices. When you think, and now we're getting into some interesting stuff because it's a little controversial, and I have to clean up some stuff that you've heard here before. So I always make the distinction, particularly in Yunnan, 1,000 years or more ancient, 1,000 years or less old. It turns out these years, scientists, tea aficionados are all using a mix of terms. So let's go to the least common denominator. In other words, the one term that people use and everybody agrees on, that 100 years and older is really special. And so they call those old trees, occasionally they call them ancient trees. So you see this in the literature sometimes. So be aware they're using that 100-year, this is in Yunnan line. Now, if you're in the tea business, you're usually using an 800-year or 1,000-year line to distinguish between old and ancient. But if you're outside of the tea business, many times you're using that 100-year-old line. So that's why you see different lines in the sand. But doesn't matter. Not really. And I'll tell you why. Well, that's deceptive also. It does matter from one respect. You're going to get a different product if the tea tree has grown 1,500 years versus 100 years, without question. We're going to get into that. That's the fun part of what we're going to do today. It will be a different product, and we'll go through what makes those differences. So you do have to, at least in your mind, be aware that it is a different product. So different product in what way? Well, the leaves have developed differently, the chemical constituents are different, and let's look as if we're all what we really are, tea investigators. We're professional tea investigators. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the Chinese tea investigators. They usually look at 5 things. After they determine, well, it's from this place, it's roughly this age, I want to make a comparison between aged, whatever you're using as a standard, 100-year line, 800,000-year line, and monoclonal. Tell me what's the difference. When you're looking and tasting the physical leaf, there are 5 things that people are typically looking at. And they're looking at the brewed output of the tea leaves. And they're also looking at the pick. What's the pick? Ancient tree, it's typically more leaves. One bud, could be 1 leaf, could be 2 leaves, could be 3 leaves, could be 4 leaves. And what's that driven by? It's driven by local custom. It's not driven, there is no rule in the sand. There is no formula from tea factories. Oh, you gotta give me 4 leaves. Actually, some of the factories do have that as a request. Give me 4 or 3 or 2 because they're blending. Ooh, blending. What are they blending? They're blending the plantation tea with ancient tea. Is that a high value proposition? So I'm gonna cut to the chase answers. No, that's not a high value proposition. The tea market in China, they look, is this all ancient tree or is this a blend of plantation and ancient? If it's a blend, it's like going to your local liquor store and saying, I want 2 buck chuck. Okay, so that's a bunch of grapes and wines all blended together. It helps you achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve with that. But whatever you're trying to do, you're not trying to impress it. And by the way, with that stuff, yeah, you don't put it in the sun, but you're not very careful about how you store it. Same with the tea. The plantation tea, generally speaking, there's less care in storage of it. Now, does that mean there's no care? No, there's some care. You also don't put that in the sun. But if you have made the investment in old or ancient tree, first off, you have to make an investment. If you go to an auction house and spend $1,000 on a bottle of wine, you're going to put that in the wine cellar, period. If you've spent $1,000 or more on a few ounces of ancient tree, you're going to be very careful with it. Why? Because you know that ancient tree will continue to age. You know that the plantation tea, especially if it's done not as a fermented tea, there's going to be a shelf life. If it's done as a fermented tea, for all intents and purposes, there's not very much of a shelf life. What I mean by that is the shelf life is quite long. However, shelf life of plantation tea, you don't have as many changes as you do with shelf life of ancient tree. All right, so this is becoming a little complicated. Let me make it simple. So again, just like with wine, what you're doing with a high value start is hoping and knowing that in some way it's going to change. And you're hoping it changes great. And the market, when they look from the outside, all right, so when people come here, when the Chinese come here from China, and they say, oh, you have Newman from 06? Oh my God, that's not blend, is it? No, that's not blend. Okay, I'll give you, they put a lot of money on the table because they have the expectation. They know Newman, that particular area, produces some of the most interesting ancient tree varietal from that mountain. And they pay big money because they know that we store it correctly here. So we age it correctly so they know it's going to have a good flavor. It's the same way when you're taking, and this is important because let's back up to what tea we have today, satisfaction. So satisfaction is from this area. So you would think about a green tea if you are going to age it, and we'll talk about the reasons most of the time you wouldn't do that, but if you were, you might age this one. And this one might end up being of enormous value. That's not going to happen with you because as soon as you taste it, you're going to say, well, I got to drink this right now because it's already of enormous taste value to me. Yes.
So you started out talking about 5 different factors.
I haven't even gotten to the first one yet.
Oh, okay, lovely then.
Hmm. So it's great because the producer keeps me on track here. You said 5, and it sounds like you just listed 55 different factors. Which of those 55 belong to the 5? 0. The 5 factors are aroma, taste, flavor, the look of the spent leaves, and the look of the stems. So those are 5 important factors when evaluating ancient versus the monoclonal. And there's distinct differences. So let's get to aroma. Aroma, the monoclonal could be more distinctive than the aged, but it's not going to be long lasting. The aroma will be maybe pungent, but short. The ancient tree tends to old and ancient tree. And when I say old and ancient here, I'm using them synonymously. And that's because we just made an artificial line, and the artificial line is 100 years or more. That tea, once it's been coming from that source, the nature of the leaves are different. So in that aroma, more pungency for the monoclonal, less for the aged, flavor-wise. Now, you're going to be initially confused because, wait a minute, and you're looking in the Merriam dictionary. I know you're all looking. Flavor, okay, there's definition. Taste, there's definition. He used flavor and he used synonyms. I did not because I'm thinking of the Chinese words. So here for flavor, they're really referring to the flavor that you get. It is from what you brewed, but it's from a tasting of it. So pin cha, they have a specific term which means take a small sip and do an evaluation. It's just like when we enter the quality arena. So certain things come up from that sip. Astringency. Let's talk about astringency and the differences of astringency between monoclonal and older ancient. Monoclonal, again, tends to be sharp, short. The ancient tree, at first, not so much astringency. As you drink down into the cup, oh, what a mistake. Not shutting off my phone. Shut off now. I apologize for that. As you do the aged tree, what happens is you drink down into the tea, it builds, but it's not sharp like it is with it's sharp and relatively quick with and these are trends, by the way. There'll always be exceptions, but this can kind of get you on the map how tea experts evaluate, because they have this in their head as they're going through. They sip first and do this initial testing. That's flavor. Taste is what happens as you subsequently deeply examine and be present and slowly go through the cup. So there you're looking at things like mellowness or non-mellowness. You're looking at things. Is there some characteristic? Is there usually more sweetness or less sweetness? You're looking for those characteristics. The tea experts in China are looking for those characteristics. And again, the monoclonal, they may give you more punch at the beginning, the aged tree gives you something all the way through. And the aged tree, without question, and almost all of you make this comment when you drink aged tree, is God, this is mellow. It's soothing, it's grounding, it's calming. The monoclonal, you almost never hear anybody talk about grounding. You hear more about, oh, the stimulant. There's stuff going on here. Yeah, there is stuff, but it's going to be short-lived. So then we go down to what the leaves look like after they've been brewed. This tea experts do this. They look at the monoclonal, and here's the thing they invariably know, and this is what you would know. Hey, these are very uniform. Must be monoclonal. Not a lot of variety going on. With the tree stuff, there's a lot of variety, I should say, because the size of the leaves is so different. They plump up differently. The aged tree plumps up to usually be quite large. Monoclonal is quite even. So you get these differences, and as you're doing your science and examination, you're noting these things. Oh, this must be aged tree. Are there exceptions? Occasionally there are exceptions. These are the trends, though, and these are what the tea experts are looking for. Then there's one other thing which is very odd, and usually we don't talk about this because, the stem, what's going on with the stem? When you take a tea stem that is monoclonal, when you break it apart, the break is always even. It looks very even, and there's no particular shape that you would attribute to that. When you take an ancient tree and break it apart, it's like a horseshoe. And so there are these differences. It has to do with different ages, components in the leaves themselves. And this is, we haven't talked about this before because this gets down into the weeds for details. So when you see Bijou looking through the leaves, she's looking for all these types of things. If you bring a tea from outside, immediately, she's looking at the dry leaves, she'll wet the leaves, she's looking at the wet leaves, she's thinking about all of these elements, because this is what the tea professionals do in China. So this gives you some background about that. All right, so those were the 5 things. Let's move on again to this area, Lin Song, and how am I doing? Let's see. Oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing just fine so far. Lin Song encompasses some famous places. So one of the famous places is Fengcheng, and we've talked about Fengcheng many times before because Dianhong, that is the red, the Yunnan red, really comes from that county. The oldest known tea tree in the world is in that county, but it's all part of the Linshan region. So this gives you context. This region has huge geographical variations. When we land in Linshan, we land at 7,000 feet above sea level. When we go to Fengcheng, we're at about 55 feet, 5,500 feet above sea level. So you're seeing there's lots of mountains that run through this whole region, and it's very, very rural. There isn't a lot of development in this region, so it really is close to its original form. Well, let's see. That let me back away from that and clarify that. What I mean is, and you see this, they preserved all these old and ancient trees. And it's because there hasn't been a lot of development. So your natural question should be, yes?
When you look at how ancient trees in Yunnan have evolved, what's in the what else is growing next to them? Types of animals. I'm just wondering what the differences are, if there are any general differences you could point to between the environment for the ancient trees in Yunnan versus the Fengqing.
Remember, Fengqing is in
Is
Yunnan.
within Yunnan.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Fengqing is part of Linsan, and that's all in Yunnan. However, your question is a good one, and there are differences. So in Fengqing, generally speaking, you're not going to find elephants. In other parts of Yunnan, you will find elephants. You'll also find many more, you'll find gibbons. So in the Aila Mountains, you find gibbons. Fengqing, no gibbons. So it's almost like a barren place because it doesn't have that same rich variety of dangerous snakes that Aila and some of the other places have. So again, the question now becomes, why satisfaction? Why the Linsan area? Because this is green tea. And last week, didn't I say that there's all these famous green teas, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 on that top 10 list that we could have picked? Why are we in Yunnan where hardly anybody realizes that any green tea is grown? Reason being is Yunnan represents a certain style of green tea. Not that much is grown, or not that much is produced as green tea. And really, when they produce it, what are they looking for? They're looking for something that's a little bit more sweet. So when we did the white tea experiments in Yunnan, part of that was also we ended up with something that was a little bit more sweet. So the tea trees, and satisfaction is from a tea tree. All of those are going to produce something that's a nice blend in a way. I use that word. There's no such thing as a nice blend. What I was really aiming for was flavor modification, to take green teas, which sometimes can be a little forward, and develop some underlying mellowness in them, just because of the source material. So that's why we're in Yunnan today. That's why we wanted to do this one at the end of 2 such previously distinctive teas. The towering pine, very distinctive, and the dragon one. Satisfaction is very distinctive in a different way. So before we have our 10-second break here, get out your notes from the last 2 sessions, take a look at them, because we're going to experience something that's a little different today. So here we go. Let's make this switch. I'll ask Bijou to come around and demonstrate, and then with no problems. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to bring the peacock adorned
Peacock.
Bijou to the screen.
Thank you. Yeah. So we do green tea.
Sasha.
早上好 Good morning. My name Bijou. Yeah. So we do green tea. Yeah, I prepare.
Oh, yeah. So the usual setup. All you need are 2 glasses, a strainer. That's what you need. Someplace that the water can go to. We have more because we're cooling down more water faster. And but at home, just 2 glasses sufficient. Green tea in general, especially at this level, when you brew, you don't cover. If you cover, you'll make it flat. So she is cleaning the glasses. You can use any temperature between 170 and 212. And you notice that Bijou demonstrates a rhythm. She wasn't at all flustered by camera malfunction. Everything is still focused here. That's where everybody should be, present, because this is a very interesting tea. You have a chance to taste something a little different.
Jeremy asked, the ancient trees, do different farmers produce different tea styles from the same tree?
Great question. So it's the way you ask the question, I have to answer yes, and then I need to explain that. So it's not 1 year you produce 3 different styles from one tree. That impossible. It is, though, year to year, you may choose to, for example, do a fully fermented versus a raw black. Or that year you may decide, maybe I'm going to do a red tea. So it's usually within that range. You would almost never do a green tea 1 year and then a fermented tea the next year. And let's think about why that has to be, because the economics of it don't make sense. When you think about the economics of doing green tea and the equipment you need for it, is it the same as the equipment that you need for fully fermented? Nowhere near. Nowhere near. The space requirements are not the same. The storage requirements are not the same. And that's the exact reason most farmers don't rotate year to year. They rotate more by field. So remembering that they usually have many small fields, and the fields can be widely dispersed, as wide as 25 miles away. And they're small though. And they might do small batches of one type of tea in one area and a different type of tea in another area. So lots of things go into that equation. All right, so Bijou heated the cups, made sure they were clean, put the 5 grams from this week's satisfaction into the heated cup, adds 170-degree water, and this is a 4-minute steeping. Okay, so the fun of each of these every week is to look at the difference in how the leaves behave. So in this one, the leaves sink to the bottom. All of them sink to the bottom. And it's just really amazing. We have some teas where some are at the top, then they slowly float to the bottom. The other thing you'll notice once it's your turn to do this is the differences in size of these leaves. These leaves, the farmers need ladders to get to the leaves. They need ladders or platforms to get to the leaves because they're not close enough to the ground. The thing about monoclonal is all of that stuff is close to the ground, and that's why they keep it monoclonal. When you're dealing with tea trees, enormously difficult. And it's difficult because you gotta build the way to get up into those trees. Secondly, care of those trees is different than care of monoclonal. The good news is these trees aren't sprayed because you're dealing with trees. And the further good news is that many of the local governments and farmers have made discussions or they've made rules about how often to pick. Just like with monoclonal plants, you can pick year round, but that's damaging to the plant. Tree even more so. So generally speaking, most of the time it's going to be one pick. And most of the time, that's going to be a spring pick. So that's kind of the rules that revolve around monoclonal and versus the tree and some of the elements of what farmers are thinking about. They don't fertilize these trees. They don't need to. They're fertilized naturally in the forest. The forest is growing all around them. You've got ground cover. You have lots of watershed in these forests. You have ferns that grow in the forest. I think somebody asked about some of the plants in the forest. The plant ground cover from a large area to large area is different, but there are plants. Ferns you can see in almost all of these forests. Uh, Typically other trees, magnolias, banyans, that might be in one of these forests. And the forest, the climate is so different. Again, the climate at the 7,000 feet above sea level is distinctly different. The further north you go in Linsan, the further towards the Tibetan Plateau you go. Some of that area is extremely rugged, much cooler than some of the other areas the further south you go. When you think about the development of tea, now we're in history briefly. Linzong and Iwu, those two areas. So Iwu on the border between Burma and China, Linzong much further north. Those two areas were prominent, and this was pre-Tang Dynasty. And then gradually in the Tang Dynasty, Linzong won out in terms of popularity. And won out in terms of popularity had to do in some ways with how the infrastructure developed to transport people. All right. 4 minutes is finished. Tea master separates the tea water from the tea leaves. And what we're going to do is enter the quality arena. We're first going to look at this. This is clearly a nice color, greenish with a slight hue of very light yellow in the background. We're going to take a sip, 170-degree sip, and we're going to look for the astringency. We talked about that a little bit. We're going to look for aftertaste, and then we're going to look at what energetics are. It's how you feel. Okay, I feel astringency. I know where. You're all going to feel it in different places. So whatever you hear anybody else say is not likely to be exactly where you feel it. That's okay. I'm going to sip again. The second sip is a verification of what I've determined in terms of aftertaste and also what I'm thinking about in terms of energetics. Energetics develops over the cup of tea. Also, in that second sip, I'm going to be thinking more about aroma. I'm going to be thinking about flavor. As I drink through the cup, I'll have a determination of taste. It's your turn to brew. So the tea master will go ahead and brew. So remember, this is going to be 170 degrees. It's 4 minutes. Heating the cup, making sure they're absolutely clean. It's a nice rhythm. Not in a hurry. Drawing the water. Our water towers have 175, so that's one of the reasons we cool down a little bit. Dissipate the steam.
Jeremy observes the dry leaves in the bag. Are this sweet, green, fresh, sweet scent.
So Jeremy calls out the fresh, sweet scent of the dry leaves in the bag. A good catch. Key master keeping, making sure the water is at the appropriate temperature. Satisfaction, she's gotten that out. Putting in the heated cup. Take it. Trying to distribute the heat in the cup.
Dylan and Teresa observe after shaking the leaves, there's a sweetness to the aroma with notes of dried apricot.
Oh, great catch. Dylan and Teresa talk about sweetness of aroma with a with a slight hint of dried apricots. Love that description. And everybody is catching. This is a little different than other green teas. And so you are going to get some hints of sweetness, hints of stone fruit. Good catch. So you set your timer for 4 minutes. It's beautiful. The tea leaves hang down at the bottom of the cup. So what else about this environment is unusual? The question was earlier asked, is the environment among the different regions, big tea regions in China, is it different or the same? And it's actually quite different. So in this region, what's the number one thing that stands out to me? There are a lot of things, but one thing in particular is the size of the bees. These are the largest bees I've ever seen. Now, if I were afraid of getting stung by a bee, I just wouldn't go to this region. They're that large. The other thing about this region, they actually eat these bees. And so that's another thing that's very distinctive. And that's the indigenous peoples who live in this region. Lots of different epiphytic plants that grow on the tea trees. So usually when they find epiphytic plants, that is plants that are growing out of the tea trees themselves, most of those become famous herbal plants, and they're used to deal with various maladies. And so when you go through looking, you don't just see the tea tree. If you look closely, you see these other little plants on it. The other thing is that the nature from area to area of the ants are different. And, usually you don't hear me talking about ants, but in this particular region, the reason that I pay attention to that is because they're very small, but they also have very sharp teeth. And they let you know if you have violated their space. And everybody knows when you're going through this particular region, be careful of those. Don't disturb them. And when you're a picker, you also are aware of all of these insects that are around you, and you know what you should pay close attention to and what you don't have to pay close attention to. The other thing that is interesting here is you have several types of insects I've never seen before, except in this region, on the trees themselves. And so obviously I don't reach out touch them because, you just don't know what you're really looking at. And when you ask the questions, many of the indigenous peoples don't speak enough of Mandarin for me to really understand what they're trying to say about the insects. So I'm just cautious. But the one thing that you don't see here, which you do see a lot in some of the other words, particularly in Isla, Isla has numerous monkeys. And in this particular region, we've not seen any monkeys. Doesn't mean that they may not exist, but at least perhaps because the generalized population has spread out into more different places, you don't see as many of those type of animals there. So those are kind of some of the differences. The other thing is that the road infrastructure, even in this area, is still difficult. Not exactly easy. All right, your timer should have gone off. Or be close to going off. You separate the tea leaves from the tea water, just as the tea master did. Now you enter the quality arena and you tell me what you find.
Dylan and Teresa say the flavor is very juicy and fruit forward.
Love this. Flavor is very juicy and fruit forward. It certainly is fruit forward. And that juiciness, yeah, you captured that correctly. I'll tell you why. Because some green teas you would tend to sip slowly. This one, because of that juiciness, I caution you up front. You're going to go through this cup and wonder, how did I get through that so fast? How did that happen? Well, it happened because of what Dylan and Teresa called out, which is a natural juiciness to this particular tea. Great catch on that.
Jeremy observes the tea liquor of light peridot green color, elusive is combined with elusive sweetness and aroma. Trichomes are cloudy on bottom of the cup. And there's a slow growing mild astringency in the front of my mouth. It's warming to the core. Immediate ability to swallow this tea.
So we come back to juicy, immediate ability to swallow this tea. Jeremy has pointed that out. A building astringency. This is important because this is different than monoclonal tea. And now you have the proof yourself. It's that building astringency, calm, warming to the core. Oh my God. Since when is green tea warming to the core? Isn't it supposed to be cooling? Aren't you supposed to drink this during the summer? Not when it's old and ancient tree. Old and ancient tree always has that ability. And I know somebody's going to ask this question because it's running through everybody's head. I can feel it. What exact compound causes that? I don't know. And more study needs to be done to identify that. But there is something in there which causes not only a warming, it just feels like my blood is circulating more strongly when I drink this tea. The other thing that Jeremy noted was a light sweetness at inception. Did I capture most everything?
Yes, let me just, the light astringency, a very light astringency, mild astringency growing in the front of Jeremy's mouth.
Ah, that's right. In the front of her mouth. In my mouth, it's more mid mouth. So again, not wrong at all. It's we're genomically different. Yeah.
Dylan and Teresa also pick up on the nicely warming quality and add that the flavor really lingers in the mouth and it builds upon itself.
Dylan and Teresa talk about the warming quality and the flavor lingering and building. So again, just like almost all old and ancient tree, flavor in the beginning starts off one place, and as you keep drinking, it builds and builds and builds and has more impact. So if you can manage to stay with it and not drink it all down in 3 gulps, you get all of these real interesting tastes, real interesting feelings that are different from your monoclonal greens. Yeah.
Rob says there's no smoke in this tea, but the astringency and texture of the tea makes me think of smoke.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Rob notes no smoke in the tea. Flavor and texture make him think, though, of smoke. But yeah, absolutely no smoke in this tea. And again, the old and ancient have all of these layers, and that's what you're unpeeling now. It's really, really nice. Yes.
Kathy says there's a light simplicity in flavor compared to Towering Pines and Dragonwell, which seemed more full bodied. This is very astringent.
So Kathy contrasts this with Towering Pine and Dragonwell, and she notes in the flavor a lighter flavor compared to the full-bodiedness of Dragonwell and Towering Pine. So let's examine that for a minute, because that is part of what we were talking about earlier, which is this sense that with a traditional green tea, especially if it's monoclonal, you're going to get it all at once. It's powerful all at once. This, on the other hand, is light but builds and keeps building. And as you go down the cup, by the end of the cup, you're thinking, hey, this is no less full bodied, but it certainly seemed that way until I got to the end. Great catch, Kathy. Yeah.
Jennifer says this green has a strong grassy flavor that sits on the
Good.
back of my tongue. Feels
Good.
super grounding, cleansing, and delicious.
Grounding, cleansing, and delicious from Jennifer. And most importantly, she talked about a lead in with grassiness. And you know what? I was waiting for this because the Chinese and myself, when I first taste this, say, oh my gosh, sweet and grassy. And all of you caught that sweetness or fruitiness, and now you're catching that grassy, because there is a grassiness. And some of you who may have thought you don't like grassy, in this combination, all of a sudden, ooh, this grassy is really good. We are excited that we got to share this tea with you. This was a great find that we had within the last year or so. And normally we don't get greens from Yunnan, but we were so impressed with this one. It was like, you know what? We got to have this. This belongs on the board because it stands on its own. It stands tall in terms of that grounding, calming. It's got a sweetness that many green teas don't have, and it's got that build up of astringency, which at the beginning you think, oh no, not very stringent. Yeah.
Benjamin observes the bottom of the empty cup smells like incense from a temple. I've gotten that from other ancient trees, but not Dragonwell last week.
Ah, Benjamin, very good. This is on the money. So he smells the bottom of the cup, and it's like an incense at a temple. And he contrasts it with last week. You get to the bottom of the cup of Dragonwell, and there's nothing. Everything in Dragonwell was about the intensity of the flavor when you're drinking it. Here, this is about experiencing the whole cup. And so we've gone from slight sweet, fruit forward, dry leaves, grounding, cleansing, buildup of astringency, and at the end, a nice temple incense. Love that commentary. and love the fact that you've linked it back to that same sense you've had with other ancient tree. Great job. All right. I am so lucky to be with the 1%ers or the 99%ers, all the same. You all are at this level where you can appreciate and take the time to identify these things. You appreciate tea the way that the tea industry people appreciate tea. I salute you for that. We've completed this green tea set, 3 weeks, Towering Pine, Dragonwell, and Satisfaction. 3 completely different green teas. You know how you hear people talk, oh, all green tea is about the same. It's very bitter and not good. Oh, you haven't been to Sophie's temple. Oh, wait a minute, that's not right. Sophie's cup of tea. You haven't had these green teas. This gives you scope of what green tea can be. So, what are we in the mood for next week? Let me think. Maybe as the weather gets colder, we should do some reds. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Maybe we should start it off with an ancient red next week called Arcadian. See if that's any good. And maybe we should follow it up with Downy Peak, see what that's all about. And then thinking about next year, why don't we do an early spring? You're in for a great lineup of reds. And this lineup of reds is going to cover more than 3 weeks also. So you have responsibilities this week. Your responsibilities this week, stay healthy. Remember, no COVID, no SR, RSV, none of that stuff. You know, that's for others. We'll see you next week. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Take care.